Mixing snares is easy. Well, at least according to FL Basics here on YouTube. Today I'm going to be giving my feedback, or basically doing a reaction video on their video. It popped up in my recommended feed, so basically doing a reaction video. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Mixing a snare to fit perfectly in the mix is like trying to fit a horse in a car. It's very difficult, but it's not impossible. I'm gonna tell you the most essential snare mixing tricks, so write down everything carefully. That way you'll never have a bad sounding snare ever again. Layering sounds is probably the most underrated trick because it can be difficult. Snares use a big part of the frequency spectrum, and if you layer it, these frequencies overlap, which means bad sounds. To make sure that doesn't happen, throw an equalizer on the second sample and cut away the lows. Then go to the first sample and cut away a small part of the highs. This will make the highs of the second sample more prominent, and it blends it together perfectly.
Okay, so the part that I agree with is the fact that layering sounds can be a great way to enhance your snare and make it much easier to essentially mix it or make it fit better in the beat. One point I just want to push back on just a little bit is using a spectrum analyzer, seeing the lower end sounds there in the spectrum analyzer and just cutting just to cut. Just because you see it there in the spectrum analyzer doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go ahead and cut it. This is a mistake that I did initially whenever I started making beats a long time ago. Like, I would do things like this, you know, look at the spectrum analyzer, see the real low sub frequencies and say to myself, hey, this is a higher end snare. I don't really need to have all this low end information. Let me go ahead and just cut it out. But you want to ask yourself, why are you cutting it out? If it's not an issue, then it's not an issue. Just go ahead and leave it there. If you enjoyed the original sound of the snare, then you just start doing stuff just to do it because you see it in the spectrum analyzer. You can kind of lose the original feeling that prompted you to actually select that snare. So instead of using the spectrum analyzer here in parametric EQ, what I like to do, and I like to recommend other people to do, is to turn off the spectrum analyzer, which you do have that option in parametric EQ2 and quite a few other visual EQs, and just use your ears. Whenever you're listening to your main snare, you want to stack another snare with it. Listen, the first thing I tend to recommend people to do is to play with the pitch. You know, if I make it a little bit lower, does it sound better? If I make it a little bit higher, does the snare sound better? And then after that, if I have a secondary snare I want to add onto it to kind of make it pop or jump out or maybe sound a little bit richer or more present, then you can go ahead and add a second snare to it and then kind of figure out a balance from there. I wouldn't just start looking at the spectrum analyzer, cutting, and then thinking based on what my eyes are telling me that everything is all good. Use your ears, only use the EQ when necessary. Start with pitching the sounds. You can even do something like reverse the polarity of the snare, which you do have the option in the FL Studio channel sampler is right there. You guys see it every day you make beats. Reverse the polarity of the snare, see if it sounds better. You can even swap the stereo. Sometimes that makes things sound better. There's a ton of different options that you can go for to make the snare sound better and kind of fit in the mix and in the beat. I would recommend staying away from using your eyes first. Use your ears first. Use the pitch. Use other things before you jump right here and look at the parametric EQ. But I do definitely co-sign the layering aspect of this advice.
You can also layer other sounds with a snare, for example a percussion. I only want this part of the perk, so I'm gonna take the sample start control and drag it up. Normalize the sample and now it sounds like this. If you play both samples together, the snare will be snappier and it cuts through the mix like it's nothing.
There's also another great bit of advice. Adding another sound other than another snare to the sound that you're working on is a great way to add extra character, texture, and really make things kind of stand out. You know, we have so many different distinct snares in the hip hop and R&B music genres that sometimes people don't really know how they were put together. You know, coming up, there was a certain snare. It was like I would hear it in a lot of Young Jeezy songs. It was like a snare mixed with like a metallic sound, And every time I heard it, I just loved it so much. So don't be afraid to experiment with adding percussion sounds, blending it with your snare. You can really come up with something unique and one of a kind.
Adjusting the transient can make the snare sound 50% better. But what is the transient? It's basically the peak of the sound. Drum sounds reach that peak almost instantly because they are very snappy. With the transient processor, you can alter that part of the sample. All you need to do is increase the attack and make it snappier. Another way to do this is by using the Fruity limiter. Head over to the compressor and set the threshold to 0 and the ratio to 100. Make the sustain a little longer and increase the attack until you hear it snapping. Now turn down the ratio and increase the gain control. And now the snare cuts through the mix.
Personally, I've never really used transient designers like that. That's just me. That's just a personal thing that I've never really found myself using. I'm definitely open to experimenting with it, seeing how it sounds in my beats and different songs that I work on. I always see transient designers, but I never really find myself actually reaching for them. I tend to just find other ways to get that transient attack to kind of snap through. Producers these days are so good at selecting sounds, whether it comes to creating drum packs, or if I'm mixing a song and a producer has their dry stems in the folder. Everything sounds so good. I've never really needed a transient designer. Sometimes I can just even pan a little bit and then the snare just pops out in the mix. I don't really have to do too much. So fortunately, I'm so grateful that sound packs have become a long way.
Using the envelope will help you shape the sound to your beats. Make sure you set the attack to 0 because we need that snappiness. Decrease the other controls until the snare sounds to your liking.
That's another really good tip. Sometimes the ringing out or the allowing of the release of the snare can kind of make things a bit buried. If you have your snare kind of just stopping abruptly, it kind of gives the illusion that it has more action, it's popping out at you a bit more. This is a really good tip. I've actually never used the envelope in this way to do that. Sometimes I'll even use a compressor to kind of snatch off a little bit of the release of a snare. But using the envelope, I've never really tried that. So yeah, I'm really my curiosity is piqued, man. This is a lot of good advice, things that I've never really thought to try out. So I'm gonna give it a try, and I'm sure I'm gonna get great results.
Giving the snare more space to play in the mix will level up your beats tremendously. Find the Fruity stereo enhancer and turn the phase a little to the right. This will give you the illusion that 2 samples are being played simultaneously, which again helps it punch through the mix.
Now that stereo enhancer trick, to me, that sounds a bit like the Haas effects. And if you haven't checked out this video, I'm gonna go ahead and post it somewhere on the screen, probably on a card here. I created a video showing you that in the FL Studio, the default channel sampler, and then there's gonna be something that says stereo delay. Now that stereo delay that you see there, if you turn it, it's gonna create that same Haas effect that FL Studio Basics was talking about, and it's a really cool effect. It makes the snare kind of sound like it's just sitting differently in the mix. It's somewhere else, and it's a really cool effect, especially for me. I have these Atom speakers right here on my left and right, and every time I use the Haas effect, it just sounds so cool to me. I can have my hi-hat back there, the snare kind of pan to the right with the Haas effect, so it's like kind of wide to me. It's so many different cool things we could do these days with modern technology. Give that a try. That's really more of an effect. I don't know if I would call that mixing it correctly. It's just more of a taste thing. Give it a try, see what kind of results you get, and let me know how it works out for you.
Sidechaining the snare with the melody and the bass. But what is sidechaining? It's actually nothing more than cutting away the audio of the melody when the snare plays. Let me show you. Select the snare in the mixer and right-click the menu on the melody or the melody bus. Choose sidechain to this track. With that track selected, open up the Fruity limiter. Go to the compressor and select snare from the sidechain list. Decrease the threshold and increase the ratio. Then increase the attack and decrease the release a little bit. Now slightly increase the threshold and then decrease the ratio. Play around with both of them.
Sidechaining. Personally, I tend to use multi-band sidechaining. This is really when I'm actually working on a full song. Really, these days producers making beats for artists to write to, or maybe entering in a beat battle. But when it comes to a final mix of a fully polished final song, at that point I tend to reach for a multi-band compressor. For instance, I like to use C6 by Waves. This we're getting kind of advanced here, so you guys take this with a grain of salt. This is kind of an advanced thing I'm talking about, but I like to use C6 by Waves, and this is typically for kicks when I'm talking about this type of side chaining. I'll use C6 by Waves to open up a pocket for like the kick to kind of punch through, and it's not side chaining the entire sound. It allows you to find a specific band, go ahead and side chain it right there, and then allow it to poke through, so the entire sound isn't getting ducked. It's just a specific frequency range. Again, this is pretty advanced. I really wouldn't concern yourself too much about this, but in the future, if you plan on mixing, you know, full songs and releasing them, you know, for any type of artist that you're recording, then yeah, you can kind of look into multi-band compression with something like C6 by Waves. Other than that, I try to kind of sonically carve out space for the snare to exist, as opposed to using side chaining in the beat making phase. In the I'm finished with the beat, I want the snare to kind of pop out a bit more. I tend not to use side chaining. That's just a personal taste of mine. I tend to just maybe use a little bit of panning, and you can be shocked about how much space you can open up just by panning a little bit. I'm not talking about a whole lot. You're working on a beat, you're finally done with it, and you're like, man, that snare is just not ringing. If you pan it even just a little bit and some of the sounds are in the way, you'll be shocked. It's like, whoa, that snare is just jumping out at me now. It might even be too present. You might even find yourself lowering the volume a little bit. That's how powerful it is. Sometimes a little bit of panning, a little bit of tuning, a little bit of carving out a little bit of space for that snare can go a long way. You don't have to do too much. Just open up a little pocket and that snare can just jump out and just hit the listener. I hope you enjoyed this video. Shout out to FL Studio Basics here on YouTube for creating that great video and allowing me to kind of give my feedback and my taste and my position on the different points that he laid out. So if you did like this video, make sure you comment FL Gang. If you love making beats in FL Studio, make sure you hit the thumbs up button, like and subscribe. I'm Desmond A, and I'll be back with more great videos. Peace. Desmond A.